Okay, let's unpack this. We all know the name Alexander Graham Bell, but you need to imagine a scientist who invents the defining communication tool of the modern world, the telephone, and then considers it a personal nuisance.
Hmm.
So much so that he refuses to have one installed in his own study. We are diving into the profound paradox of Alexander Graham Bell, the reluctant inventor.
It truly is a fascinating historical dichotomy.
Hmm.
Bell, born 1847, he was this Scottish-born Canadian-American scientist, an engineer, a professor, and maybe above all else, a dedicated teacher of the deaf.
Right.
And while history credits him with patenting the first practical telephone and co-founding AT&T in 1885, he explicitly viewed that commercial success as an intrusion on his serious scientific pursuits.
That's the core of our deep dive today. Our goal is to give you a shortcut to understanding that restless, brilliant mind. We've pulled together sources covering the deep personal connections that drove his work, the cutthroat legal battles that defined his early success, his astonishing forgotten genius in fields like optical communication and aeronautics.
And, of course, the complex and often uncomfortable truth about his late career interest in heredity and eugenics.
Exactly.
If we look at the trajectory of his life, what's truly compelling is the sheer breadth of his curiosity. We're moving far beyond the predictable story of the patent war to see a mind that ranged, as one source put it, unfettered across the scientific landscape.
Unfettered is the perfect word. He was tackling the fundamental challenges of sound, flight, and marine speed with this equal, almost frenetic fervor. To begin to understand Bell, we have to start not with technology, but with his family history. I mean, his background was absolutely steeped in the study of speech and sound.
Completely. His entire male lineage, his father, his grandfather, his uncle, they were all expert elocutionists.
So this was the family business.
This was a professional lineage, almost a dynasty dedicated to the mechanics of voice. His grandfather was a noted elocutionist in London, his uncle in Dublin, and his father, Alexander Melville Bell in Edinburgh, was a renowned phonetician.
And his father wrote a book, right?
A hugely influential one. Melville Bell's textbook, The Standard Elocutionist, published in 1860, was wildly successful. This wasn't some niche academic volume.
Not at all.
It sold over 250,000 copies in the U.S. alone.
Wow. And what was the practical application of this book? What was it teaching?
It detailed methods to teach individuals described in that era as deaf mutes, how to articulate sounds, how to read lips. So the family profession was literally about bridging the gap created by silence.
It's all about making the invisible visible.
Exactly. And young Alexander Graham Bell and his brothers were just immersed in this world. They learned a system their father developed called visible speech.
Can you elaborate on that? What did visible speech actually look like for someone who's never encountered it?
Well, think of it as a kind of universal phonetic alphabet, but purely visual and anatomical. Instead of letters, you had these symbols shaped like parts of the mouth.
Like the tongue, the lips.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The symbols would indicate if a sound was made by the lips or the back of the tongue or through the nose. It was a direct map.
So you weren't reading a word, you were reading instructions for your own vocal cords.
That's a perfect way to put it. Our sources state that Bell and his brothers could accurately recite written tracts of languages they had never even heard, like Sanskrit or even obscure Scottish Gaelic dialects, just by deciphering these anatomical symbols.
That's astonishing mastery. It shows why Bell views speech not as some magical gift, but as a mechanism that could be analyzed and replicated.
And this rigorous training, it was fundamentally shaped by personal tragedy.
Right. It wasn't just an academic exercise for him.
Not at all. The application of visible speech was deeply personal. Bell's mother began losing her hearing around age 12, which profoundly influenced him and became the focus of his communications efforts.
So he had a direct daily connection to the problem he was trying to solve.
A very deep one.
Yeah.
He learned manual finger language or dactylology just so he could sit silently with her and communicate effortlessly. He also developed this unique, almost proprietary technique for communication with her, didn't he?
He did. He learned to speak in these extremely clear, modulated tones, delivering them directly into her forehead.
Into her forehead, so she could feel the vibrations.
Exactly. She could perceive the vibrations and the subtle tones, which allowed her to follow conversation with reasonable clarity. And later, this personal connection to deafness was cemented when he met his future wife, Mabel Gardner Hubbard.
And she had also lost her hearing as a child.
Yes, near her 5th birthday after a bout of scarlet fever. His life's work truly emerged from his personal world.
These weren't just theoretical exercises, though. Bell had this knack for practical, if sometimes whimsical, early inventions.
Like the flour mill dehusker he created when he was just 12?
A perfect example of applied ingenuity. The local flour mill operator complained about how hard it was to dehusk wheat. So Bell, after noticing the problem, just puts together rotating paddles combined with sets of nail brushes to efficiently scrub the grain.
And it worked.
It worked so well it was reportedly used for several years.
Incredible. And then came the more foundational experiments related to voice, like the automaton.
Yes, in 1863, his father took him to see a famous mechanical man, automaton, designed by Sir Charles Wheatstone. It was basically a machine that simulated the human voice.
And Bell and his brother were inspired.
So inspired, they built their own version. They used forced air from a bellows and carefully manipulated these leather lips to produce a recognizable, if a bit rudimentary sound. Mama.
Building on that, he moved from automata to actual animals. There's the famous and slightly humorous anecdote about his Skye Terrier, Truve.
It's a classic story. It really demonstrates his patience and his focus on vocal mechanics. Bell taught his dog, Truve, to emit this continuous low growl.
So that was the basic sound source.
That was the carrier wave, if you will. Then, by physically manipulating the dog's lips and vocal cords while the sound was being made, he could shape the output into the crude joke phrase, "How are you, Grandmama?"
And people actually thought the dog was talking.
Visitors were genuinely baffled, believing the dog was articulating human speech.
These early forays into vibrational and acoustical science really set the stage for his most famous discovery. But that discovery was famously spurred by a mistake: the valuable blunder.
That's right. When Bell was 19, he wrote a report on his sound experiments, and a renowned philologist, Alexander Ellis, lent him a copy of Hermann von Helmholtz's seminal work, The Sensations of Tone.
But he couldn't read the original German.
No, he was working from a French translation, and, crucially, he mistranslated a key section.
What exactly did he think Helmholtz had achieved?
He mistakenly believed that Helmholtz had electrically transmitted vowel sounds and critically articulate human speech. So he thought the great challenge of electrical voice transmission had already been solved.
He must have been crushed to think you're on the cusp of a breakthrough and find out someone already beat you to it.
It was, but the psychological result was the opposite of surrender. Bell didn't give up. He just redefined the problem. He deduced that if Helmholtz had only achieved vowel sounds by electrical means, as Bell mistakenly believed, then consonants and full articulate speech must still be possible.
So that mistake became his motivation.
The primary motivation, the quote is famous. If I had been able to read German in those days, I might never have commenced my experiments.
The belief that a challenge still existed was the psychological engine that powered his research for the next decade.
Unfortunately, this fertile period was quickly followed by tragedy. His two younger brothers succumbed to tuberculosis, Edward in 1867 and Melville in 1870. The family was devastated.
And this fear for Alexander's own health led to a major relocation.
Yes. His parents moved to Brantford, Ontario, in Canada, hoping the change of climate would benefit Bell, who was also frail and sickly at the time. He followed them in 1870, and the move was a success. His health rapidly improved.
And he found a new creative sanctuary there, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He set up a workshop in a converted carriage house on the family property, situated near the beautiful Grand River, which he affectionately dubbed his dreaming place.
His dreaming place.
It was there, away from the constant pressures of urban academic life, that he continued his electrical sound experiments. He was even modifying a pump organ, a melodeon, to try and transmit its music electrically over a distance.
But his engagement in Canada wasn't just limited to his experiments. He extended his family's pedagogical mission to the local community.
Right, he took a profound interest in the local Six Nations Reserve at Onondaga, which was located just across the river. Bell learned the Mohawk language, and he applied his visible speech training to translate its previously unwritten vocabulary into the standardized phonetic symbols.
So he was preserving a language using his father's system.
An unprecedented effort in linguistic preservation and standardization. And for this significant work, he was honored with the title of Honorary Chief.
That interaction truly showcases his commitment to communication in all its forms, regardless of financial reward. Which, of course, sets the stage for a dramatic contrast with the next section of his life, which was driven entirely by commercial and legal battles. Bell eventually returned to Boston, primarily to continue teaching, but his focus had fundamentally shifted from pedagogy to pure experimentation. The commercial context he stepped into around 1874 was just dominated by the telegraph industry.
It was a time of intense industrial competition. I mean, the telegraph was king, but the infrastructure, the actual wires, was incredibly expensive.
So the big players, like Western Union, were looking for a way to get more out of their existing lines.
Desperately. They were desperate for a solution to send more than one message over a single wire simultaneously. The goal was cost reduction and efficiency. This became known as harmonic telegraphy.
Let's pause there for a moment. For those who haven't studied it, how does harmonic telegraphy actually work, and why did it become the crucial jumping-off point for the telephone?
Certainly. Harmonic telegraphy relied on the principle of resonance and frequency. You would set up several metal reeds or tuning forks, each tuned to a different specific frequency, say 100 hertz, 200 hertz, 300 hertz, and so on.
Okay, so each message gets its own unique frequency.
Exactly. When a sender pressed a key associated with one reed, it would vibrate, sending an electrical current matching that specific frequency down the line. At the receiving end, only the reed tuned to that exact frequency would vibrate and make a sound or mark a paper.
So you could stack multiple messages on one wire.
Up to 8 or 10, as long as each message used a separate frequency. Bell was intensely focused on perfecting a multi-reed device for this very commercial application.
And this commercial focus, despite his academic interests, is what attracted the necessary funding.
Precisely. Bell, juggling his teaching schedule, needed capital and resources. He secured the backing of two wealthy men, Gardner Hubbard, whose deaf daughter Mabel he was tutoring and would later marry, and Thomas Sanders. They funded the development of his harmonic telegraph.
But as he chased the harmonic telegraph, he was inadvertently laying the groundwork for something far bigger. His research stalled until he found the right technical collaborator.
Thomas A. Watson, an experienced electrical designer and mechanic in Boston. Watson was absolutely crucial. Bell had the scientific theory, this idea of a vibrating current, but Watson had the hands-on engineering skill.
And the big breakthrough came by accident.
A complete accident. They were working on June 2nd, 1875, testing this multi-reed system. Watson, in one room, was trying to free a stuck steel reed by repeatedly plucking it.
And Bell, at the receiving end, expecting to hear nothing but static, heard something entirely new.
He heard the distinct overtones of the plucked reed, the harmonics. This was the breakthrough moment.
Why was that so important?
Because it proved that the current, caused by the vibration of a single armature, was complex enough to carry not just a simple on-off signal, but the entire complex waveform of the sound. This showed that a single armature, not multiple tuned reeds, was needed to transmit all sounds.
Including human speech.
Including human speech. That single moment led to the first true voice transmission, though still highly rudimentary. But the race to the patent office was now critical.
This is where the narrative tension becomes incredibly high. Bell's lawyer filed his application for improvement in telegraphy, which included the basic concept of the telephone, on February 14, 1876.
And the clock was ticking against his rival, Elisha Gray, who was also being backed by Western Union.
Right.
Gray, operating independently but under similar competitive pressure, filed a caveat, which is essentially a formal notice of intent to file a patent for a water transmitter design.
And he filed it when?
That very same morning. Historians estimate the difference in filing time was just a few hours.
The stakes were astronomical. If Gray's caveat had been filed slightly earlier, or if Bell's patent had been delayed, the entire course of telecommunications history might have changed.
But Bell's patent was ultimately issued very quickly, on March 7, 1876.
And the famous proof of concept followed just 3 days later. But this is where it gets really controversial, isn't it?
Immensely controversial. Because for that proof, Bell used a liquid transmitter, a design strikingly similar to the one Gray had just described in his caveat.
So the device that spoke the world's first clear electrical words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," was based on a design filed by his rival. That sounds damning.
It is complex. While Bell used the liquid transmitter for that crucial proof, because it was capable of producing higher fidelity sound than his original electromagnetic device, he immediately abandoned it afterward. He focused solely on improving his electromagnetic design for commercial use.
So what was his legal defense?
Bell asserted that his primary claim rested on the core concept of the undulating electrical current, a theory he had documented in a draft application dating back to February 1875, a full year before the patent race. This was key to his legal defense.
But the controversy didn't go away.
Yeah.
It exploded into a full-blown scandal with the Wilbur affidavit. This is pure courtroom drama.
Absolutely. Years after the patent was granted, the patent examiner, a man named Zenas Fisk Wilbur, stated in an affidavit that he was struggling with alcoholism and was in debt to Bell's lawyer, Marcellus Bailey.
Okay.
And Wilbur claimed, under oath, that he had shown Gray's caveat to Bell, allowing Bell to add the crucial variable resistance claim to his application just before filing.
So the accusation is that Bell had inside knowledge of Gray's design just before the final submission.
That was the accusation. Bell denied paying Wilbur directly, but he did admit in a letter to Gray that he had learned some of the technical details, perhaps through casual conversation with the examiner.
So how did he win in court?
The legal complexity allowed Bell to prevail. Gray ultimately abandoned his caveat, believing he couldn't beat Bell's prior documentation, especially that 1875 draft, which described a cup of mercury, that supported Bell's fundamental claim to variable resistance.
The courtroom drama didn't end there, though. For years, the Bell Telephone Company was constantly fighting off claims.
Constantly. The success of the technology meant every inventor with a prior claim, no matter how tenuous, lined up to challenge him. The results, though, they speak volumes about the strength of Bell's foundational patent and his legal team.
What were the numbers?
The Bell Telephone Company successfully defended its core patent rights in an astonishing 587 court challenges over 18 years. They never lost a final trial.
587. That statistic is unbelievable. If there was genuine fraud, you would think at least one of those cases would have resulted in a loss.
It indicates that while the circumstances of the filing were highly, let's say, ethically questionable, the legal structure and documentation of Bell's core concept, the undulating current, were ultimately robust enough to withstand endless scrutiny.
We also have to acknowledge the claims of Antonio Meucci, the Italian inventor, often cited today as the true pioneer.
Yes, the Meucci claim adds another layer of complexity. Meucci alleged he had created a working communication device, a teletrophono, as early as the 1830s, and certainly had working models in the 1850s.
And he filed for protection.
He filed a caveat in 1871, but critically, he couldn't afford to renew it after 1874.
Why did his evidence fail in court then?
In the legal context of the time, the challenge was primarily dropped due to a lack of material evidence. Meucci testified, but his financial struggles meant he lacked the resources to properly pursue the patent, and crucially, his working models were reportedly lost or stolen.
So without the physical proof, the claim struggled.
Exactly. Without the physical evidence to prove prior art in a court of law, the claim couldn't stand up against Bell's meticulously documented patent.
And it's important to state, as our sources do, that while the U.S. House of Representatives in 2002 did formally acknowledge Meucci's work, the legal victory at the time went to Bell because of superior documentation and, frankly, better financial backing.
The system rewards not just invention, but successful patent prosecution.
Despite all the chaos, Bell moved quickly to prove the device's utility. The long-distance test was paramount.
The third major demonstration, on August 10, 1876, was highly symbolic. Bell set up a call between Brantford and Paris, Ontario, a distance of 8 miles or 13 kilometers. This is widely cited as the world's first long-distance call.
And the response from the public and the scientific community was rapturous. His debut at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia drew massive, captivated crowds.
Even Emperor Pedro II of Brazil was there. He famously exclaimed, "My God, it speaks."
Wow.
And Sir William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, one of the most respected scientists of the age, he called it the greatest by far of all the marvels of the electric telegraph. That type of endorsement provided instant credibility.
And the royal endorsement soon followed.
In 1878, Bell demonstrated the device to Queen Victoria. She called it quite extraordinary. The Bell Telephone Company was founded in 1877, capitalizing on this buzz. By 1886, just 9 years later, over 150,000 Americans owned telephones.
The speed of adoption is incredible, but there was a real technical obstacle at first, right? The faintness of the sound.
That was a huge hurdle. It was overcome in 1879 when Bell acquired the crucial patent rights to Thomas Edison's carbon microphone. This invention dramatically increased the clarity and volume of transmitted speech.
So you no longer had to shout into the mouthpiece.
Exactly. The phone became truly practical for long-distance commercial application.
And we can't forget the famous missed opportunity for Western Union.
It's one of history's great commercial blunders. Bell and his partners, struggling financially in the early days, offered to sell the patent outright to Western Union for a mere $100,000.
And Western Union said no.
They famously dismissed the device as nothing more than an expensive toy, something impractical for serious business. By the time they realized their mistake, the Bell Company was profitable and the patent was no longer for sale. Bell, despite his own indifference to the phone, was now independently wealthy.
Despite the immense commercial and legal pressure from the telephone, the sources consistently confirmed that Bell's primary professional identity remained rooted in his family tradition. A teacher of the deaf.
This was the work that genuinely fulfilled him. In 1871, he traveled to Boston to train instructors using his father's visible speech system. He opened his own school there the following year. It was a mission of assimilation, driven by his personal connection to his mother and future wife.
He also took on one of the most famous pupils in history, Helen Keller.
Bell's work with Helen Keller is legendary. He met her as a child who was unable to see, hear, or speak. He played a pivotal role in connecting her with Anne Sullivan, her teacher. Keller herself later reflected that Bell dedicated his life to penetrating the inhuman silence which separates and estranges individuals from society.
Bell's approach was characterized by his strong support for oralism. Can you explain why that stance, encouraging speech and lip reading, became so controversial within the deaf community?
Well, Bell sincerely believed that by teaching deaf individuals to speak and read lips oralism, rather than relying solely on manual sign language, they would be integrated more fully into the hearing society. He saw this as a path to greater opportunity.
But the deaf community viewed sign language as a natural, essential cultural identifier.
Exactly. And the controversy really peaked in 1880 at the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf in Milan.
Right.
That conference, heavily influenced by Bell's growing prominence in the field, passed a resolution banning signing in schools. This was devastating to many. Members of the deaf community have since criticized Bell for supporting ideas that led to the decline of schools that use sign language, seeing his push for oralism as an attack on deaf culture itself.
It's a vital historical context. An individual acting with what they believe is benevolent intent, but whose actions have profound negative consequences for a community's cultural integrity.
It highlights that Bell, the great communicator, often struggled to fully grasp the culture of silence he was trying to overcome.
However, we must also recognize his financial commitment to the cause. He used his first major financial reward not for personal gain, but for research.
He did. In 1880, he won the Volta Prize, 50,000 French francs for the telephone invention. The judging panel included Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas.
That's quite a panel.
And he immediately channeled that money into establishing the Volta Laboratory Association in Washington, D.C., and later the Volta Bureau in 1887.
And what was the explicit mission of the Volta Bureau?
It was dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge relating to the deaf. It gathered statistics, published research, and acted as a central clearinghouse for information.
The Volta Laboratory was also an innovation engine for other projects, particularly sound recording.
That's a key detail often overlooked. Bell and his associates significantly improved Thomas Edison's phonograph. Edison's early device used a thin sheet of tinfoil that was easily damaged. The Volta team replaced the tinfoil with wax.
Which gave it better fidelity and durability.
Much better. And they changed the method of recording itself, too. Instead of indenting the recording, which Edison did, the Volta Laboratory developed a method of incising it, cutting a groove into the wax cylinder. These key upgrades made the phonograph a commercially viable machine.
Now we have to transition to the most controversial part of his later life. His research into heredity and genetics, often linked to the eugenics movement.
This requires careful nuance. Bell's intellectual interest in heredity began much earlier, spurred by Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species. He was deeply curious about selective breeding.
And this started with sheep, not people.
Correct. For over 3 decades at his Canadian estate, Brie, he conducted meticulous selective breeding experiments with sheep. His goal was very practical: to produce a breed with multiple nipples, hoping they would bear twin lambs and increase the profitability of wool production.
So how did this transition from practical sheep breeding to human genetics?
Bill was concerned with the high incidence of deafness in families where both parents were deaf. In 1883, he published a hugely influential paper titled Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race.
And what did this paper argue?
It compiled extensive, carefully gathered data showing that deaf parents had a significantly higher proportion of deaf offspring compared to the general population.
This research demonstrated a hereditary tendency, but did the paper itself advocate for any of the harsh legislative actions we now associate with the eugenics movement?
Crucially, no. The paper did not advocate for legislative interference. such as forced sterilization or the prohibition of intermarriage. Bell's personal philosophy rejected that government intrusion.
What did he say specifically?
He stated plainly in the paper, "We cannot dictate to men and women whom they should marry, and natural selection no longer influences mankind to any great extent."
So he saw his work as pure data compilation, demonstrating a tendency, but separating himself from political action. Was he naive to think his raw quantitative data wouldn't be seized upon and effectively weaponized?
It raises that precise question. While historians confirm Bell consistently refused to support public policy that limited the rights of the deaf, and never mentioned sterilization in his own writings, the very fact that his data existed, compiled by a scientist of his stature, made it invaluable to others.
And that's exactly what happened with Charles Davenport, a Harvard professor and founder of the American Breeders Association.
Davenport and the burgeoning eugenics movement needed scientific legitimacy. Bell's data provided that. Even though Bell's personal views were cautious, his public association was a powerful endorsement.
So he lent his name to these organizations.
He did. In 1910, he was named chairman of the board of scientific directors for Davenport's Eugenics Record Office. And even late in his life, in 1921, he served as honorary president for the Second International Congress of Eugenics in New York.
So his high reputation and his compiled data lent immense credibility to organizations that actively pursued policies he didn't personally endorse. It's a profound example of how scientific influence can diverge from individual intent.
It certainly is. His legacy in this area remains a critical ethical point of study, illustrating the complex responsibility scientists carry when their research findings intersect with powerful, often dangerous social ideologies.
Let's shift now to what Bell himself considered his true life's work. The telephone may have made him famous and wealthy, but he viewed that success as almost accidental. Here's where it gets really interesting, because his true passions lay in fields that wouldn't become commercially viable for decades.
That's the great irony of this story. He was an accidental industrialist. His heart belonged to pure scientific discovery, to solving the next great challenge. And his favorite invention of all was the photophone.
The photophone, this sounds like something out of a futuristic novel, especially for that era. What was this wireless telephone and how on earth did it work?
Jointly invented with Charles Sumner Tainter at the Volta Laboratory, the photophone was a device designed to transmit sound wirelessly, not via radio waves, but on a beam of light.
Light as a carrier signal in 1880.
Yes. The basic mechanism was elegant. A highly reflective, thin mirror was placed in front of the speaker. As Bell spoke into the device, his voice vibrations caused the mirror to subtly undulate, reflecting sunlight or a powerful artificial light source, with corresponding variations in intensity.
So this speech was literally encoded into the brightness of the light. How was it received?
The receiving end used a crucial component, a selenium cell. Selenium, when exposed to light, changes its electrical resistance in proportion to the amount of light hitting it. I see. The fluctuating light beam from the transmitting mirror struck the selenium cell, converting the light intensity back into a corresponding undulating electrical current, which is then fed into a standard telephone receiver and translated back into sound.
That is genuinely groundbreaking. He achieved wireless voice transmission years before Marconi developed practical radio.
Absolutely. On June 21st, 1880, they successfully transmitted a wireless voice message 700 feet from the roof of the Franklin School to the window of Bell's laboratory in Washington, D.C. This was 19 years before the first voice radio transmissions.
And he considered this his greatest work.
He called the photophone his greatest achievement, claiming it was superior to the telephone.
But it never went anywhere commercially, did it?
No, it was a technology looking for an infrastructure that didn't exist yet. Its master patent was issued in 1880, but because light can't penetrate fog or buildings, it wasn't practical. It was a technological dead end until fiber optic cables-guided light pipes were developed. It was a century ahead of the market. The photophone is the direct precursor to modern fiber optic communication.
Bell's interest in instantaneous problem solving also led him into a brief critical medical invention, the metal detector.
This happened in 1881 under tragic circumstances. President James A. Garfield was shot. The physicians couldn't locate the bullet lodged inside him, so Bell developed one of the earliest versions of a metal detector, using an induction balance to try and save the president's life.
How does an induction balance work?
It generates a magnetic field. When a piece of metal enters that field, it disrupts it, inducing a slight current change in a receiving coil, which produces an audible click in a receiver. It was crude, but ingenious.
But the attempt failed.
It did. The attempt to locate the bullet was unsuccessful, and Garfield died several weeks later. Initially, some accounts blamed the steel bed springs underneath the president, claiming they interfered with the magnetic field.
But that wasn't the whole story, was it?
No. Bell, ever the meticulous scientist, published a paper concluding the bullet was simply lodged too deeply for the crude apparatus to detect. The technology lacked the required sensitivity. Despite the tragic outcome, his work established the fundamental principles for modern metal detectors.
As he grew older and his financial stability was secure, Bell shifted his attention increasingly toward his Canadian estate, Brie, and the monumental challenges of flight and speed on water.
He was captivated by aeronautics. He felt flight was the ultimate engineering challenge. And crucially, his wife, Mabel, stepped up as a vital financial and managerial patron for this work.
She funded it.
With her financial backing, she helped Bell establish the Aerial Experiment Association, or AEA, in 1907. Bell was the chairman, and the team included young, ambitious engineers like Glenn H. Curtis, who would become an aviation pioneer in his own right.
Bell's personal contribution involved his fascinating work with kites. They weren't just standard kites.
No, they were known as tetrahedral box kites.
Hmm.
Bell believed that the tetrahedron offered maximum strength and stability with minimal weight. He built these massive manned kites like Cygnet the Sect and the Second the Third, all covered in maroon silk, to understand aerodynamics and lift.
And the AEA quickly translated that theoretical work into practical flight.
They did. Their first practical achievement was the Red Wing, which achieved the first public flight in North America in March 1908. But their greatest contribution to global aviation was technological. They developed a practical wingtip aileron.
What's the significance of the aileron?
Before the aileron, pilots typically relied on wing warping, twisting the entire wing-to-control roll, which was inefficient and structurally weak. The AEA team created a hinged flap on the trailing edge of the wing. It's a simple, elegant design that's now a universal component on virtually every aircraft flying today.
And their final aircraft synthesized all their learning.
The Silver Dart. It embodied all their advancements. On February 23, 1909, flown by J.A.D. McCurdy from the frozen ice of Brasor Lake in Nova Scotia, it made history as the first aircraft flight in Canada.
While he was pioneering flight, he was simultaneously applying similar principles of lift and low drag to the water.
Indeed. He was inspired by earlier work on hydroplanes and hydrofoils. Bell believed that true speed required lifting the hull out of the water.
Can you explain the principle of a hydrofoil?
A regular boat hull displaces water, creating significant drag. A hydrofoil is essentially an underwater wing. As the boat accelerates, the foil generates lift, lifting the main hull completely out of the water and dramatically reducing drag.
This intense experimentation led to the creation of the massive hydrofoil craft, the HD-4.
The HD-4 was a magnificent vessel. After the First World War, Bell secured two powerful 350-horsepower Renault aircraft engines for it. It was a pure speed machine. On September 9, 1919, the HD-4 set a world marine speed record of 70.86 miles per hour.
70 miles per hour on water in 1919. That's astounding.
That record held for 10 years. It confirmed his belief that overcoming resistance, whether electrical, aerodynamic, or hydrodynamic, was the key to progress. But his curiosity didn't stop there. He was relentlessly innovative.
We have evidence of him using primitive air conditioning in his home.
Yes. In his home, he created an early form of air conditioning by using fans to blow currents of air across great blocks of ice stored in the cellar, piping the cooled air through ducts. He also researched ways to separate salt from seawater and find alternative fuels.
His thoughts on alternative energy were particularly forward-thinking.
He was anticipating modern concerns. He reasoned that methane gas could be produced from farm and factory waste. And in a magazine article in 1917, he wrote extensively about using solar energy to heat houses, visualizing a sustainable energy future long before it became a global priority.
Bell's life was defined by this incredible, restless energy and the constant movement between his teaching, his lab in D.C., and his sanctuary in Nova Scotia. He found his anchor in his family.
His marriage to Mabel Gardner Hubbard in 1877 was a major turning point. As a wedding present, he gave her 1,487 of his 1,497 shares in the newly formed Bell Telephone Company.
A gift of immense value. It illustrates his ongoing indifference to the commercial side of the venture.
And his trust in his wife's financial acumen, Mabel's wealth and commitment allowed Bell the freedom to pursue the more esoteric projects like the AEA and the HD-4. His primary home in later life, B&B Gaelic for Beautiful Mountain in Baddock, Nova Scotia, became his intellectual sanctuary.
For 35 years, it was his true laboratory, a compound where he could conduct large-scale, private experiments from sheep breeding to boat building.
And despite being a naturalized U.S. citizen since 1882, Bell maintained strong ties across the Atlantic. He was proudly claimed as a native son by the U.S., Canada, and the U.K.
Bell died at Beanbury on August 8, 1922, at the age of 75.
It was a beautiful final scene. His coffin was constructed by his own laboratory staff from Beanbury pine and lined with the red silk fabric that had been used in his beloved kite experiments, a final nod to his passion for flight.
And his final communication was, fittingly, in the silent language he shared with his wife.
As his wife Mabel tended to him, distraught, she whispered, "Don't leave me." Unable to speak, Bell signed the word no before losing consciousness, a profound, silent tribute to the man who gave the world its voice.
But the tribute that followed his funeral was one of the most remarkable public moments in telecommunications history.
Upon the conclusion of his funeral, for 1 minute at 6:25 p.m. Eastern Time, every phone on the continent of North America was silenced in honor of the man.
Think about the scale of that. Millions of conversations interrupted across two nations, all silenced simultaneously. A massive tribute paid through the very technology he tried to escape.
His influence, however, extended far beyond commercial telephony. He was a regent of the Smithsonian Institution and president of the National Geographic Society from 1898 to 1903.
And his tenure at National Geographic fundamentally changed the magazine, didn't it?
It revolutionized it. He was instrumental in pioneering the extensive use of photography, insisting that the magazine must not just describe the world, but show it, which cemented its reputation for visual storytelling.
And finally, his core science of sound is literally embedded in our language of measurement.
Fittingly, the unit of measurement of sound pressure level, the Bell, B, and its more common counterpart, the smaller decibel, dB, were named after him. In 1936, the U.S. Patent Office declared him first on its list of the country's greatest inventors.
So what does this all mean for us today? Bell wasn't just an inventor. He was a magnificent convergence point for 19th century scientific obsession. Sound, sight, air, and water, all fueled by a personal drive to overcome distance and the barrier of silence. He was an accidental industrialist whose accidental commercial success overshadowed his true passions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Bell's legacy is a powerful case study in the unpredictability of scientific priority. His biggest market triumph was the invention he barely respected, while his greatest achievement, the photophone, sat dormant for nearly a century before its foundational principles were realized commercially in fiber optics.
Bell made the first ceremonial transcontinental call in 1915, speaking 3,400 miles to Thomas Watson on the traditional copper wire network. Yet he repeatedly insisted that the future of long-distance communication was wireless and silent, conducted via light, the photophone. This raises an important question for you, the learner, to consider. When you look at today's technology, from your Wi-Fi, your 5G network, and the copper phone line that may still run to your building versus the fiber optic cable carrying gigabits of data beneath the oceans, are we living primarily in Bell's accidental legacy, the switched electrical network, or his greatest achievement, the optical future? Which one would you say defines the modern age?
Welcome to the debate. Alexander Graham Bell is, of course, universally recognized as the inventor of the telephone. Yet, as our source material repeatedly stresses, Bell himself considered that monumental invention a mere detour from his true life's work. His lifelong dedication, driven by the personal experience of having a deaf mother and a deaf wife, Mabel Gardner Hubbard, lay in acoustics, communications, and the education of the deaf.
And that duality, the inventor of global, instantaneous communication versus the teacher focused so intensely on conquering individual silence, that's precisely where the historical and ethical challenge resides. We are not discussing the financial or technological legacy of the telephone. We're focusing entirely on Bell's profound and, I would argue, deeply problematic influence on the deaf community.
Exactly. So, the central question we have to grapple with is this. Was Alexander Graham Bell's pervasive influence on deaf education and his extensive research into heredity primarily a progressive, humanitarian effort toward assimilation, aiming to equip the deaf with tools for integration, or did the force of his advocacy and scientific ideology inadvertently lay the groundwork for long-term, scientifically justified social harm?
A crucial question.
I'll be maintaining that Bell's actions were fundamentally humanitarian, that they were driven by a deep personal commitment aimed at equipping the deaf to participate fully in the hearing world through communication he believed was liberating.
And I will be arguing for the latter position, that despite his clear personal investment and, laudable intentions, Bell's determined advocacy for specific exclusionary methods, coupled with his scientific focus on the deaf race, led directly to disastrous policy decisions, most notably the suppression of sign language, causing profound cultural marginalization and intergenerational damage.
My perspective really begins with the deeply intimate nature of Bell's commitment. His entire life was defined by the experience of deafness. He dedicated his resources and his reputation to what he called the penetration of that inhuman silence. The concrete tool he championed was visible speech, which was a universal system of phonetic symbols his father developed, designed to visually map the articulation of sounds. This allowed teachers to instruct the deaf in speech therapy and lip reading, which we know as oralism. Bell genuinely believed that mastering speech was the single most vital skill for the deaf to integrate fully and successfully into mainstream society. He didn't see it as replacing a culture, but as building a necessary bridge. And to institutionalize this work, he used the substantial 50,000 French francs from the 1880 Volta Prize to establish the Volta Laboratory and in 1887, the Volta Bureau. This was an institution dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge relating to the deaf. This was a significant, selfless commitment of private resources to a public good. And crucially, when he explored the hereditary aspects of deafness in his influential 1884 paper, Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, he meticulously compiled data, but explicitly resisted endorsing government control. Historians who have examined his papers, they confirm he consistently refused to support public policy that limited the fundamental rights or privileges of the deaf, including marriage prohibition. His intent was understanding and assimilation, not state control or elimination.
I come at it from a different way, focusing not on his personal motivations or the philanthropic establishment of the Volta Bureau, but squarely on the immense political weight his authority carried, which led directly to harmful policy. Bell's unwavering focus on oralism, his assertion that speech and lip reading were the superior, indeed the only proper method, had immediate, devastating, and policy-driven consequences that actively undermined the thriving deaf community of the late 19th century.
I see.
The most catastrophic policy victory aligning with Bell's ideology was the 1880 Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf in Milan. Driven by oralist advocates, the Congress passed a resolution mandating the teaching of oral communication and explicitly banning the use of sign language in schools. This wasn't just a change in educational technique, it was a cultural edict. By lending his scientific authority to this cause, Bell helped ensure that this resolution was globally adopted. Furthermore, his academic curiosity regarding heredity, it quickly crossed into politically dangerous territory. His 1884 memoir, By Systematically Studying Intermarriage Among the Deaf, explicitly raised the specter of a deaf race, providing a scientific rationale for anxiety among the hearing public that this was an undesirable trait requiring intervention. His later formal roles only confirm this ideological proximity. He was the chairman of the board of scientific directors for the Eugenics Record Office starting in 1910. And served as honorary president of the Second International Congress of Eugenics in 1921. His authority sanctified a toxic movement.
Well, that brings us directly to the first and perhaps most damaging consequence, the legacy of the 1880 Milan Congress and the subsequent suppression of sign language. The core tension is whether Bell's desire for assimilation justifies the means used to achieve it. Bell's vision was truly assimilation into the hearing world. He saw oralism as the mechanism that would allow deaf individuals to converse freely with their hearing family members, neighbors, and potential employers. He was, in fact, critical of institutional practices that segregated deaf children into isolated schools, preferring instead to integrate them into mainstream classrooms where they could practice their acquired speech. He saw speech acquisition as profoundly liberating, evidenced by his wife Mabel, who became a skilled lip reader and orator after scarlet fever took her hearing. He believed he was giving the deaf access to the dominant culture's primary mode of communication.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the personal success of one individual or even the stated intent of liberation can justify what happened after Milan. That resolution to ban signing was not merely a shift in pedagogy. It was an act of forced cultural denial. It resulted in the immediate firing of hundreds of deaf teachers globally who were native signers and experts in their field. Residential schools, which served as crucial cultural centers for the deaf community, were forced to abandon American Sign Language. This policy did not assimilate deaf children. It forcibly denied them the means of cognitive development and cultural connection. Instead of integration, it fostered isolation, confusion, and educational failure for generations of deaf students who were now forced to struggle through an instruction method that, frankly, simply did not work for most of them.
But surely we must acknowledge that Bell's scientific perspective wasn't one of cultural elimination, but scientific rigor applied to a problem. He was attempting to use empirical data to solve what he saw as a communication barrier. His advocacy wasn't about suppressing a language he understood to be rich, but about promoting a communication method he believed was superior for economic and social mobility within the larger hearing society. When we talk about cultural aggression, we risk oversimplifying a 19th century scientific mind trying to apply the principles of communication and acoustics, the very principles that just yielded the telephone, to a profound personal challenge.
That defense of his scientific curiosity fails to account for the political weight his status carried. Whether he intended to be culturally aggressive or not, the impact was unequivocal. The most significant and unifying cultural marker of the deaf community, their language, was eradicated from the institutions meant to educate them. This forced change created a massive psychological and educational deficit. For decades, deaf children were often separated from one another, discouraged from communicating freely, leading to a breakdown in the transmission of deaf culture and history. We have to look at the long-term, verifiable harm to the development of deaf identity, which was systematically marginalized by the very educational system Bell championed.
Let us then move to the issue that most directly connects his scientific rigor with political consequences: the interpretation of the 1884 memoir upon the formation of a deaf variety of the human race. You point to the alarming title, yet the document itself was a compilation of demographic and genealogical data on hereditary deafness, a necessary academic exercise at the time. The author of a contemporary review in the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb explicitly noted that Bell did not advocate state-mandated restrictions. That review stated, and I'm quoting here, that Bell does not advocate legislative interference with the marriages of the deaf for several reasons. Instead, Bell suggested that educators should understand the laws of transmission and then guide pupils to choose partners wisely. This is scientific investigation aimed at informed, private choice, not public mandate.
I come at it from a different way, looking at the rhetorical context rather than his explicit policy footnotes. Regardless of his ultimate reluctance, the mere act of studying the deaf variety and presenting that data to the esteemed National Academy of Sciences provided a crucial, high-level scientific endorsement for eugenics anxiety. Bell meticulously collected data demonstrating that if deaf people intermarried, their chances of having deaf children were exponentially higher than the general population. By systematically framing this as potentially leading to the emergence of an undesirable race, a term which held significant weight in 19th century racial science, Bell legitimized the growing concern that deafness was a trait to be eliminated through breeding control. He weaponized statistics, even if he didn't personally pull the trigger on marriage restrictions. His science created the justification for alarm. And that fueled the eugenics discourse that immediately followed.
That fueling of eugenics discourse leads us directly to the most uncomfortable aspect of his legacy, his later formal affiliations. You highlight his involvement with eugenics leaders like Charles Davenport, the founder of the American Breeders Association and the Eugenics Records Office. His role as honorary president of the 1921 International Congress of Eugenics certainly placed him at the apex of that scientific framework. We can't dismiss this as just academic curiosity. Davenport's office was actively lobbying for state sterilization laws and immigration restrictions based on spurious concepts of biological fitness. Bell's name and immense scientific authority as a pioneering investigator in human heredity gave legitimacy to those organizations.
Exactly.
I would argue, however, that we must distinguish between Bell's personal methodology and the political ambitions of those he advised. Bell's decades-long work in heredity was renowned for its methodological rigor. His most famous experiments involved meticulous breeding trials with sheep on his Nova Scotia estate, specifically to produce a breed with multiple nipples and a propensity for twinning. This was applied hard science. Historians later noted that in an era rife with crackpot theories, Bell's methodical, genealogical approach was ironically lauded as the gold standard for human heredity studies in 19th century America. His later advisory roles in the Eugenics Records Office may simply reflect a desire to apply that sound scientific rigor to an emerging field that was, at the time, widely accepted. It's plausible he saw his role as ensuring data was collected accurately rather than endorsing every political transgression associated with the movement.
That's a critical distinction to attempt, but it fundamentally misjudges the power dynamic. In 1910, the Eugenics Records Office, the ERO, wasn't just a research center, it was an advocacy organization with significant political influence. Bell wasn't just observing, he was chairing a scientific board for an office run by Davenport, who actively sought to classify human traits, including deafness, as genetically undesirable defects. Bell's authority was the gold standard precisely because he had conducted that massive 1884 data collection. By accepting the chairmanship, he provided the ERO with the scientific cover and public relations credibility it desperately needed to push its agenda forward. His refusal to endorse the most extreme measures personally does not negate the fact that his scientific work and subsequent affiliation were foundational to the movement's justification for social control. He lent his name, his intellectual currency, to the institutionalization of eugenic ideology.
But I must push back on the idea that every scientist engaging in heredity research at that time was necessarily endorsing the darkest outcomes. To study heredity in the early 20th century was, by necessity, to be operating within the framework and terminology of eugenics. Bell's focus remained primarily on understanding the laws of transmission, which he saw as serving an educational and preventative purpose, empowering individuals with knowledge, not stripping them of their rights. If he had completely withdrawn from the field, it would have been left entirely in the hands of those with less nuanced scientific approaches. His continued engagement could be interpreted not as wholesale endorsement, but as a cautious scientist attempting to apply rigor to a field desperately lacking it.
That's a compelling argument for intellectual charity toward Bell, but it requires us to overlook the devastating practical impact on the deaf community, which suffered policies of forced assimilation and cultural erasure directly enabled by his life's work in this field. It forces us to prioritize the scientist's intellectual integrity over the societal consequences of his immense influence. The ban on sign language stands as a profound historical tragedy directly traceable to the successful advocacy of oralism by Bell and his peers.
Bell's legacy with the deaf remains uniquely complex, certainly. It is indelibly marked by a deep, personal, familial commitment and the creation of lasting educational institutions like the Volta Bureau. His core desire was integration and liberation through the achievement of speech. We should remember that he identified himself, to the end of his days, primarily as a teacher of the deaf.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because we must weigh the long-term systemic impact over the personal intent. The forced suppression of sign language following the Milan Congress, reinforced by Bell's towering authority, imposed cultural and psychological damage that lasted for over a century. Coupled with his formal, high-level association with organizations promoting eugenics, regardless of his specific policy reluctance, his work in this field has to be viewed critically as a major enabling contributor to policies of societal harm and marginalization.
Bell's life clearly reveals an expansive scientific mind that was ceaselessly curious, leading to groundbreaking work across optical telecommunications, hydrofoils, and aeronautics. The complexity of the man often seems to exceed the clarity of his inventions.
But it is the work most closely tied to his personal life, the effort to conquer silence, that demands the most rigorous ethical and historical scrutiny. The material shows us an individual whose commitment to a singular ideal of assimilation resulted in policies that actively suppressed a rich linguistic and cultural identity.
Indeed. His legacy serves as a powerful reminder of how personal dedication and scientific authority, when channeled into a singular, unwavering vision, can produce both monumental innovations and deeply damaging social consequences. There's clearly more to explore in the material regarding the full ethical and historical impact of his numerous wide-ranging pursuits.